Heaven, Sin, Sex in a Pan, Robert Redford dessert. Why Robert Redford? Hi everyone, welcome back to my kitchen and to time capsule cooking. Now this week I'm doing something slightly different. You could probably already tell from the title of the video, but school has started. I'm teaching 6th grade and I am exhausted. So I'm going to be trying something this week that's probably no less vintagey, but is certainly at least more familiar for me. I'm going to be making my mom's recipe for Butterscotch Heaven. In researching this dessert to see kind of what other variations there are out there of it, I ran across so many different names for it. Heaven, Sin, whatever you choose to call it, it is essentially a layered pudding dessert, starting in this case at least with a pecan shortbread crust, a layer of sweetened cream cheese, a layer of pudding, whatever flavor of your choice. We always preferred butterscotch, and a layer of whipped cream, and then whatever decorations that you want to put on top in the form of candy or pecans or what have you. It's a fairly simple recipe, and I figured what better way to take advantage of my exhaustion than by showing off one of my mom's best recipes. I'm only making half of the recipe today, but I'm going to be putting the full amounts in the ingredients list. We'll need 1½ cup self-rising flour, 1½ sticks of margarine melted, 1 cup chopped pecans, 1 cup confectioner's sugar, which I'm going to be making a sugar-free variation for myself since that is a hassle to find. I'll be using just regular Splenda and some cornstarch. We'll also need 1 8-ounce package of cream cheese, 1 large 16-ounce Cool Whip, 2 small 1-ounce boxes of butterscotch instant pudding, and 3 cups of cold milk. The first step is to make the shortbread crust. So I've got my oven preheating to 350 and I'm going to be mixing the flour, butter, and chopped pecans. And pat it out in our baking pan. And normally you would use a 9x13 sized pan. I'm hoping that this won't be too big considering I'm only doing half of the recipe. And I think actually that turned out pretty well. You'll note that I didn't grease the pan or put any flour in beforehand. Evidently, because of the amount of butter in the shortbread crust, there's not really any difficulties getting out of the pan afterwards, even if you don't grease it. We're gonna put it in the oven and let it bake for 17 to 20 minutes. Meanwhile, while our crust is baking, it's time for a small adventure in sugar equivalent making. I've got a cup of Splenda in here and a tablespoon, I believe, of cornstarch. I'm going to mix this in the bullet blender here and see what we come up with. Now, is this going to end up being dust storm of sugar? This does not look any more like a half cup. That should still be the right amount, right? Okay, it's been about 18 minutes. The crust has just come out of the oven. It looks nicely lightly browned, but this thing has to cool for, well, until it's completely cooled before I can put the rest of the stuff on. So meanwhile, I'm going to be fixing up our other layers. For the cream cheese layer, we're going to mix the powdered sugar, the cream cheese, and half of the tub of Cool Whip. Now, I've had some issues in the past with mixing Splenda with practically everything. I'm hoping, since I made sure that the cream cheese was good and soft this time, and I'm dealing with confectioner sugar instead of just normal Splenda, it will work. without too much issue. For the pudding mixture, we are going to be putting in our pudding mix along with 3 cups of milk if you're making the full recipe, which is less than you'd use if you were just making some pudding. So the pudding mixture is going to be a little bit thicker than just normal pudding. So it's about halfway through mixing the butterscotch pudding that I remembered that Mom always mixes the butterscotch pudding with the mixing bowl in the sink because the pudding goes everywhere. Butterscotch pudding everywhere. Thankfully, I'm only making half the recipe, half the amount of splatter involved. Just keep in mind if you are going to be making this recipe that you may want to account for the extra cleanup time. Now that the crust is cooled, it is time to finally assemble our layers. We're going to start with the cream cheese layer. Add in the pudding layer on top of that. And finally, top it with the remainder of the Cool Whip. And I'm using a little bit of the remaining pudding and pecans to decorate the top. Afterwards, we cover this and we stick it in the fridge to cool. Okay, it's the next morning. If you can't tell by my puffy eyes, it's too early. It's after 10 this morning and it's still too early. But despite my lingering exhaustion, we have dessert to try out this morning. And yes, I'm going to be eating this for breakfast. The butterscotch oven has been sitting in the fridge overnight. The ingredients will have by now had time to mingle or whatever they're going to do. Hopefully not mingle since it's layers. Take on their final forms into the dessert that hopefully has turned out okay. Let's go ahead and give it a shot. So all the flavors kind of really meld in together really well. You can taste the individual elements, but there's nothing that stands out overwhelmingly. The crust, where it's not sweetened and uses a self-rising flour, almost has a slightly salty quality, which balances out really well with the layers of pudding and sweetened cream cheese and Cool Whip and the nuts that are in the shortbread layer and layered on the top adds a nice crunch to it. The shortbread layer isn't really crisp or the type of layer that I would compare to a pie crust. It really is like shortbread. I really probably could have baked it a little bit longer to get a more firmer texture. To be honest, I probably baked it for a little bit less long than I normally would have because I was filming and I forgot to set the timer. Most people do these sort of desserts with chocolate, and I love chocolate. But I think there's really just something to be said for what the warm flavor of the butterscotch adds to these sort of desserts. And if you haven't tried one of these with butterscotch, I really do recommend it. But that leads me to a question. What is your favorite version of this sort of layered pudding dessert? Do you use a flavor other than chocolate or butterscotch? Do you use a different sort of crust? In the past week, I've ran into so many different versions of this recipe, and I'm really interested to see what variations you guys use on this. I was really happy to be able to show you guys my mom's version of it, and I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, make sure to like this video, subscribe if you want to see more, and until the next recipe, bye.